Amy Wilson wearily wiped the counter for the third time in 10 minutes. The small diner where she had worked for the past 2 years was nearly empty, which meant fewer customers and even fewer tips, something she couldn't afford right now. Rent was due soon, and she wasn't sure if she'd be able to make it. The bell above the door jingled. Amy looked up and saw a thin man standing quietly at the entrance. His clothes were worn, his boots covered in dust, but his eyes held a quiet dignity. He stepped forward hesitantly and placed a few crumpled bills on the counter. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice rough and weary. "What can I get for $5? Amy glanced at the menu. The cheapest meal was at least $8. She knew 5 wouldn't be enough, but something in his tired eyes made her decision easy. "You're in luck," she said with a small smile. "We have a special today. 1 full meal for $5. The man hesitated, as if kindness was something he wasn't used to. He looked at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. Amy quickly prepared a steaming plate of food and placed it in front of him. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "Everyone deserves a hot meal," she replied. But before he could take a bite, a sharp voice cut through the diner. "Amy, what do you think you're doing?" Rick, the diner's manager, stormed over, his expression a mix of irritation and disdain. "I paid for it myself," Amy said calmly. Rick scoffed. "This diner isn't a charity. If you want to feed bums, do it somewhere else." Then, to Amy's shock, Rick grabbed the plate of food and tossed it straight into the trash. The entire diner fell silent. The man remained still, his expression unreadable. But Amy felt rage boil inside her. "You're a disgrace," she said through clenched teeth. Rick crossed his arms, smirking. "And you're unemployed." For a moment, Amy thought she had misheard him. But then she saw the way he stood, his smirk widening. "You're firing me?" she asked. "That's right," Rick said. "Grab your things and get out." The silence in the diner was deafening. Amy scanned the room, hoping anyone would speak up. But the other employees kept their heads down, too afraid to get involved. The few remaining customers sat frozen, whispering among themselves but saying nothing aloud. The man slowly stood, locking eyes with Rick. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Rick snorted. "I don't owe you anything, old man." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded once and turned to Amy. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. Amy forced a small smile, though her heart felt heavy. "I wish I could have done more." "You already did more than most," he replied before walking toward the door. Amy turned back to Rick, her jaw tight. "You're going to regret this." Rick let out a dry laugh. "Doubt it." Amy grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold night, uncertainty swirling in her mind. She had no job, no backup plan, no idea what she was going to do next. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in just 24 hours, everything would change forever. At a crossroad, Amy walked away from the diner, her steps heavy with uncertainty. The cold night wind lashed against her face, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside her. She had just lost her job, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done the right thing. Her feet carried her aimlessly back to her small apartment. The tiny space felt emptier than ever, with only a worn-out bed and a cramped kitchenette. She tossed her coat over a chair and collapsed onto the bed, her gaze landing on a stack of unpaid bills. Rent was due in a week, and now, with barely any money left, she had no idea how she was going to make it. That night, Amy lay awake, tossing and turning. The image of the meal being tossed into the trash, the quiet resilience in the homeless man's eyes, and Rick's smug grin played over and over in her mind. The injustice of it all burned inside her, but the fear of what came next burned even more. The next morning, she bundled up in the warmest coat she had and stepped outside. She couldn't afford to be afraid. She needed a job, any job. She spent the entire morning going from cafe to grocery store, from bookstore to bakery. But everywhere she went, she got the same tired response. "Sorry, we're not hiring right now." By noon, Amy found herself back near the familiar streets of Joe's Diner. Across the road, she saw it was still open, operating as if nothing had happened. Rick was behind the counter, going about his day like she had never existed. Amy clenched her fists. A part of her wanted to walk in and tell him he was wrong. But would that change anything? Then, suddenly, a deep rumbling noise filled the air. A military convoy rolled into town, the heavy armored vehicles slowing to a stop, right in front of Joe's diner. Amy held her breath. The doors of the vehicles swung open, and a group of U.S. Marines stepped out, standing in formation. And among them, she recognized a familiar face. The homeless man from the night before. But today, he was no longer just a drifter. He stood tall in a decorated military uniform, his chest adorned with shining medals. Amy didn't know what was about to happen. But one thing was certain, everything was about to change. The forgotten soldier. The bell above the door chimed as a group of uniformed men stepped into Joe's diner. The air in the restaurant grew tense. Rick, the diner's manager, blinked in confusion as he took in the sight of a high-ranking military officer leading a squad of U.S. Marines. "We're looking for Amy Wilson," the officer said, his deep voice calm yet commanding. Rick hesitated. "She doesn't work here anymore." "We know," the officer replied, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The door swung open again, and in walked a man Rick never expected to see, the homeless man from the night before. But today, he was no longer the disheveled, weary drifter Rick had dismissed. He stood tall, his posture strong, clad in a pristine military uniform adorned with gleaming medals. Rick stiffened. Frank met his gaze, his expression calm, yet unyielding. "He's not just a veteran," the officer spoke again, his tone measured but cutting. "Frank Mitchell is a war hero. He saved dozens of Marines in combat, risking his own life to protect his brothers." Silence fell over the diner. Customers whispered among themselves, their eyes widening in shock. Rick swallowed hard, struggling to compose himself. I didn't know." Frank stared him down. "No, you didn't care." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. At that moment, the door opened one more time. A young woman stood in the entrance, Amy. Her eyes swept across the room, landing on the Marines, then on Frank, before finally settling on Rick. "Hello, Amy," Frank said, his voice warm. A slow smile formed on her lips, emotions swelling in her chest. The officer stepped forward and handed her a business card. "We need people like you. People who see the worth in others when the world turns its back." Amy looked down at the card, her heart pounding. Rick scoffed, breaking the silence. "She's just a waitress." The officer turned to him, his gaze cold as ice. "She's done more in a single night than you've done in your entire life." Amy glanced at Frank and saw the quiet pride in his eyes. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, she knew exactly where she was meant to be. Everything had changed, and this was just the beginning. The truth revealed. The air in the diner grew thick with tension. Rick stood frozen behind the counter, trying to steady himself as the group of Marines stood before him. Among them, one man stepped forward, Frank. But he was no longer the weary, homeless man Rick had once dismissed. Today, he stood tall in a crisp military uniform, his chest adorned with gleaming medals of honor. Rick licked his lips, his voice dry. "What can we do for you?" Colonel James Carter, the officer leading the group, stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Rick. "We're here to talk about how you treated one of our soldiers." The diner fell into complete silence. Customers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Rick and the Marines, waiting to see what would happen next. Rick swallowed hard. I didn't know who he was." Frank's voice was calm, but carried undeniable authority. "No, you didn't care." Rick clenched his fists. "Look, I wasn't obligated to. You threw away the meal of a man who once put his life on the line for this country." Colonel Carter interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "And worse, you fire an employee simply because she had the courage to do the right thing." Rick took a deep breath, but before he could respond, the diner's door swung open again. Amy stepped inside. Her eyes scanned the room, stopping on Frank, then Carter. Finally, she met Rick's gaze, the man who had carelessly discarded the meal she had paid for with her own money. Carter turned to her, then held out a business card. "Ms. Walker, people like you are rare. We want you to join our veteran support program, a job that truly matters." Rick scoffed, letting out a bitter laugh. She's just a waitress. Carter turned to him, his expression cold and unyielding. She's done more in one night than you have in your entire life. The diner remained silent. A few customers nodded in agreement, while Rick's face paled. Amy looked down at the card in her hand, her heart pounding. Frank stepped forward, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. You helped me when the world turned its back. Now it's time for you to take this chance for yourself. Amy glanced at him, then at Carter. She knew what she had to do. I accept. And with those words, she stepped out of the diner, leaving Rick behind to face the truth that he had just lost one of the best employees he had ever had. A turning point. Amy sat on the bench outside the Veteran Support Center, clutching the business card Colonel Carter had given her. The printed words felt heavy in her hands. An invitation, an opportunity to do something bigger than just standing behind a counter. She had lost her job simply for helping a stranger. But that stranger, Frank, now stood before her in a distinguished military uniform, his gaze warm and filled with trust. You don't have to say yes if you're not ready, Frank said, his voice steady yet gentle. Amy took a deep breath, glancing around. She was used to struggling, to barely making ends meet, to surviving on just enough without ever daring to dream of something more. But today, everything felt different. This job, what exactly would I be doing? She asked, a hint of hesitation in her voice. Colonel Carter offered a small smile. We help veterans transition back into civilian life. Many, like Frank, need support, not just with employment, but with connection, with knowing that someone truly cares. Amy looked down at the business card. Her entire life had been spent doing ordinary jobs, never believing she could make a real difference. But hadn't she already started by helping Frank? Frank gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You helped me when no one else did. You have a good heart, Amy. That's something not everyone has. She looked up at him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't just a job. This was a chance to do something meaningful, to change lives, including her own. Taking a deep breath, Amy met Colonel Carter's gaze. I'll do it. Carter's smile widened. Welcome to the team. Frank nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride. Something inside Amy shifted. This wasn't just a career decision. It was a turning point, a new path, a new life. And for the first time in a long while, she no longer felt lost. A new beginning. Amy stood in front of the Veteran Support Center, her heart swelling with emotion. 6 months ago, she had been nothing more than a waitress at a small diner, fired for buying a meal for a homeless man. But that single moment had led her here, to a place she never thought she belonged, but now felt like home. She stepped into her small office, where neatly stacked files covered her desk, each one representing a veteran she had helped. On the walls, framed photos of smiling veterans served as reminders of the lives she had touched, people who had found jobs, housing, and, most importantly, a fresh start. The door creaked open, and Frank walked in. Gone was the weary, homeless man she had once met. Now he stood tall in a crisp button-down shirt, the center's logo embroidered on his chest. How's work treating you? Frank asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. Amy smiled. Busy but worth it. Frank nodded, glancing around the office. Did you ever think we'd end up here? Amy let out a soft laugh. No, but I'm really glad we did. Frank studied her for a moment, pride evident in his eyes. You've helped more people than you realize, Amy. She glanced down at the files on her desk. Each name, each story, each life she had been a part of. For so long, she had believed that her small act of kindness wouldn't matter. But now she knew better. One small action could create a ripple effect far greater than she had ever imagined. We can't change the whole world, Amy said, but we can change someone's world. Frank chuckled, and sometimes that's enough. A warmth spread through her chest. 6 months ago, she had thought she had lost everything. But in truth, she had gained something far more important. A purpose, a family, and a path she never imagined walking. And this was only the beginning. A day to remember. Amy took a deep breath, scanning the vast hall of the Veteran Support Center. Today was an important day, the first event she had personally organized, bringing together veterans in need with employers, support organizations, and people willing to listen. All morning, Amy had been busy working alongside volunteers, hanging banners, arranging tables, and double-checking the guest list. From across the room, she spotted Frank speaking with a group of younger veterans, his face brighter than she had ever seen it. The doors swung open, and the first guests began to arrive. Some hesitated at the entrance, uncertain if they belonged here. Amy noticed a middle-aged man standing off to the side, gripping an old military cap tightly in his hands. She walked over with a warm smile. "Hi, I'm Amy. Can I help you with anything?" The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I'm not sure. I just came to look around." Amy understood that feeling all too well. 6 months ago, she had been just as unsure, wondering what difference she could possibly make. But now, she knew that sometimes all it took was an open door for someone to step through. "No rush," she said gently. "We have a lot of great organizations here. If you'd like, I can introduce you to a few people." The man hesitated again, then slowly nodded. Amy led him to a resource table where another veteran was sharing his experience of finding a job after leaving the military. As the minutes passed, more people filled the room. Conversations sparked, handshakes were exchanged, and smiles began to appear on faces that had once been marked by uncertainty. The room buzzed with connection, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. By the end of the day, Amy stood beside Frank, taking in the sight before them. "You did it," Frank said, his voice filled with pride. Amy smiled, her heart swelling with happiness. This wasn't just an event, it was a new beginning for so many. And she knew that this was only the first step in a long journey ahead. A small piece of paper, a big meaning. Amy stood on the steps of the Veteran Support Center, watching people come and go with a smile on her face. Today's event had been an overwhelming success. Dozens of veterans had found jobs, housing, or simply someone willing to listen. She took a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment after a long, busy day. But then, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Amy." She turned and saw Frank standing there, dressed neatly in a button-down shirt, his usual kind smile on his face. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Amy nodded. "Of course." Frank stepped closer and pulled a small, worn piece of paper from his pocket. Its edges were crumpled and aged with time. He placed it in her hand. Amy frowned slightly, unfolding it, and recognized it immediately. It was the receipt from Joe's Diner, the night she had bought him that fateful meal. "You kept this?" she asked, surprised. Frank nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet emotion. "That night, when you bought me this meal, it wasn't just food you gave me. You gave me something I thought I had lost long ago, the belief that someone still cared." Amy clenched the paper in her hand, her heart tightening. Frank continued, his voice warm yet steady. "I fought, I sacrificed, but when I came back, it felt like the world had no use for me anymore. But you saw me as more than just a homeless man. You saw me as a person worthy of dignity." Amy felt a sting in her eyes, tears threatening to form. "I just did what anyone should do." Frank chuckled softly. "Maybe, but you were the only one who did." She looked down at the small, fragile piece of paper in her hand, realizing that even the smallest act of kindness could change an entire life. Frank gave her shoulder a reassuring pat. "And now, because of you, I get to do the same for others." Amy smiled, her eyes glistening. "I think we're doing the right thing." Frank nodded. "Not just the right thing, the necessary thing." She tightened her grip on the old receipt. A reminder, a milestone, a symbol that kindness, no matter how small, could transform a life forever. Conclusion and life lesson. Amy's story reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what we can imagine. What started as a simple meal turned into a life-changing moment, not just for Frank, but for Amy herself. In a world where people often turn a blind eye to those in need, Amy chose to see, to care, and to act. Her compassion led her to a new purpose, proving that doing the right thing is never in vain, even when it comes at a cost. Sometimes standing up for what's right means facing challenges, but as Amy's journey shows, it can also lead to opportunities we never expected. A lesson for today's world. In today's fast-paced, often self-centered society, It's easy to overlook those struggling around us. But what if we all took a moment to show kindness? A simple gesture, buying a meal, offering a listening ear, or standing up for someone, can be life-changing. People like Frank exist everywhere, in every city, in every community. Many are fighting silent battles, just hoping for a sign that someone still cares. And people like Amy, ordinary individuals with extraordinary compassion, have the power to make a difference. Now, it's your turn. How can you make a difference today? Look around. Is there someone in your community who needs help? Take action. A small act of kindness can change someone's life. Be a voice. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. If this story inspired you, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it so more people can see the power of compassion. And if you want to see more content like this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness changed your life? Let's spread positivity together. Remember, kindness costs nothing but means everything. Let's make the world a better place, one small act at a time.